We would now like to invite Mr. Anders Aslund, Senior Fellow, Peterson Institute for International Economics. And you can find more information about Mr. Aslund's bio in the program that has been distributed to everyone. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I want to turn particularly to Andreas Drakopoulos and in general to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. I would also like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for the very generous and steady support it has been given to my employer, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, throughout the years. As Andreas said here, what I want to talk about today, it is how to look upon the social welfare society in the new framework that we're now seeing in Europe, and in particular, how to, where does philanthropy come into this broader framework. And as Andreas already said, we all now know that the social welfare state can't do everything. The market has to take over more functions, but there are also many functions that the market can't do in various ways, and therefore a third sector philanthropy is needed. We are all here together in beautiful Greece, and this is unfortunately a country that has fallen into a serious economic crisis, the worst we have seen in a crisis-ridden Europe. But my message to you today is that all crises can be resolved, and we can look upon other crises in Europe that have been resolved in the last decades. In particular, I want to contrast with what has happened in Sweden, which was hit by a serious crisis slightly over 20 years ago. And so what I want to do here is combine the building of a new social welfare society with some observations of a possible resolution of the Greek crisis as it seems today. So what we have learned in the last 30 years or so is that the old social welfare state doesn't function. And country after country have experienced that public expenditure has become too large and therefore become unsustainable. The tax rates have become too high, and therefore it has, in many countries, become not worth working. And even so, budget deficit has become too large. The Greek budget deficit was 15.6% of GDP at the worst, but the Swedish budget deficit in '93 was 11% of GDP. Many other countries have had as large budget deficits as Greece had. It's not that extreme. And on top of that, over-regulated markets, notably labor markets. So how do we see change? The sad thing is that we don't learn with our heads. We only learn through crisis. And in the early 1990s, the Nordic countries went through a serious financial crisis. At about the same time, the communist system collapsed in Eastern Europe. Now we are seeing Southern Europe in a serious financial crisis. This is tough, but it's also a major opportunity. 2 years ago, I wrote a book with the current Prime Minister of Latvia, Valdis Dombrovskis, about how Latvia came through the financial crisis. He came in as Prime Minister in Latvia in March 2009, when GDP was in complete free fall. Latvia in 2 years had as large a decline in GDP as Greece has had now, 24%. And Dombrovskis said, in this situation there are two alternatives. One is bad, and the other is worse. I prefer the bad one, he said. And after this, he sacked 1/3 of the civil servants, closed half of the state agencies, deregulated as much as he could, cut public wages by 26%, but his own wage by 35%, and the wages of ministers. They quickly got on the right track, and he has been re-elected twice after this. It is possible, but of course, the smaller the country these things are. It's not necessary that you succeed when there is a crisis, often you fail, but it is a possibility. So what is needed is a new thinking. The social welfare states had failed, but a social welfare society is needed, meaning that there are many more private elements in it, while the state has to do less, but what it does, it should do better. And there's also needed to have political change. Serious reforms usually require a new government, and often they require several new governments. If you look upon the early post-communist period, the best reformers were the three Baltic states and Poland. For about a decade, they changed government each year. It improved reforms. It's not bad with political instability, as people so often think. It's bad with a stable, bad government. And if a new government fails, it needs to be replaced. Frequent elections and unstable coalition governments often facilitate reform. Because what happens in a coalition government? You have parties that really know what the others are doing and who do not necessarily like one another. It's very good to have criticism close to power. And new thinking is always controversial. Therefore, consensus is not possible. In a crisis, you always hear, but we must find a new consensus. Yes, that's true, but not in the crisis, after some new ideas have worked and functioned. And my message here to you today, any nation can build a modern social welfare society, it should be here, by bringing down public expenditures under control and reform the state so that it serves the citizens rather than serving the officials. Eliminate the budget deficit, reduce public debt gradually, lower tax rates, deregulate markets, and expand the role of the private sector, both profit-seeking and non-profit. And what can you then achieve? That's what we are seeing today in Northern Europe. Higher growth, strong public financing, sound external balances, and lots of innovative enterprises. So, in principle, this is quite easy. In a political reality, of course, it's very difficult. So let us then see what has been accomplished and where does Greece stand in these regards. The first task I put was to cut public expenditures when they are too large. Sweden has, in the last 20 years, cut public expenditures by 20% of GDP. Faster in the beginning and then steadily. This is possible. More should be done. Greece, at the same time, has increased public expenditure substantially from 45% to last 54%. It has to come down. A country like Greece should not have more than 45% of GDP in public expenditure. That's the most obvious task. The second task is check the budget deficit. Here, Greece is on a good way to be resolved. The blue line here is Greece, and the red line is Sweden. And you can see here how Sweden had a very big budget deficit in the early 90s and was then quite equal to Greece. but brought it under control and has had a steady budget surplus essentially since 1998. Greece will be fine if it cuts the public expenditure as is necessary, and much of that is underway. This is the problem, the third task, to reduce public debt. Greece has an unsustainably high public debt. It has to be written off in one way or the other. One write-off of a privately held public debt has already been done. Now it's the turn for the European governments to accept that they have to write off some of it. I would say that that is underway while it's not publicly stated. The fourth task is to cut tax rates, and here it might come as a positive surprise to you that this Greece has already done. It's the red pillars here are Greece versus the rest of EU 15 in 1981 to 2012. Greece has a perfectly competitive corporate profit tax of 20%, nothing wrong in that. And of course, deregulate. This is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index in its latest version. And this is what I see as what should be the most easy thing to do, simply to cut red tape, give enterprises freedom. Deregulation is normally quite easy because it's a question of abolishing unnecessary laws. And here Greece comes almost at the bottom of Europe. Admittedly, Malta is the worse. Italy is almost as bad. But this is a very bad indicator, and this should be easy to adjust, because these are in many but relatively technically simple legal changes to make. And for example, the easiest ways of creating jobs is to liberalize professions, so that any person can work in many professions. And labor market reform. This is one of a steady thing to do. One of the big problems in Greece is youth unemployment. That is now more than half of the youth that desire to work can't find jobs. This could be amended with apprenticeships, which means public-private partnership of a nature that can improve both skills and the future of society. And the most difficult tasks are education and healthcare. This is for much of Europe that we are seeing that these are big problems, and it takes time. Financing stays public, but open competition between private and public providers should be given. State guarantees should be providing certain financing for access to all and quality control, but here there should be a substantial role for non-profits and charity. And I'll come back to here. This is an area where I think that the non-profit sector has an enormous role to play, in particular in spreading online higher education. This is one of the biggest opportunities that one can imagine. But let me show also here how Greece is doing in terms of education. Generally in Europe and the US, 80 to 90% of the labor force have graduated from high school. Greece is lagging a bit behind here at 65%. But what is really shocking is the rest of Southern Europe, and in particular Portugal, where only 38% of the labor force has graduated from high school. And then there is no surprise that no fiscal stimulus works in Portugal. In this regard, Greece looks much better. Italy is far worse, as is Spain, than Greece. But the question is quality. This is the OECD PISA math test for 8th grader. And the latest numbers are only from 2009. And here we see that the East Europeans, who had good numbers in terms of how many people who get education, are coming out rather poorly when it comes to quality, in particular Bulgaria and Romania. But after those, Greece has actually the worst quality in terms of math education in secondary school. So this is clearly something that takes a lot of effort and should be a big focus. But let me then move over to what all of you here are doing. Neither state nor market can do all, and therefore there are a lot of roles for philanthropy. And the old traditional role has always been social welfare. There's always something that is missing. That is nothing new in that. Research and education is also a traditional area, but that is also becoming new. Here there are alternative selection criteria and there are alternative technologies. George Soros, who will be speaking here tomorrow, he took the opportunity when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe and promoted new textbooks everywhere and translation of the best Western textbooks. And he also built up elite universities in various countries, particularly the Central European University in Budapest and the new economic school in Moscow. So he built or supported throughout the best higher education that existed in the former communist bloc. And only he could get it done fast enough. If it had been a state initiative from any side, it would have taken years and the quality would not have been the same. Similar as concerns healthcare and of course art, where you have the artistic freedom and a matter of taste, policy, intellectual freedom, and here I would talk about our role in Washington. Washington today has no less than 400 think tanks out of 6,600 think tanks identified in the world. And one reason is that think tanks in Washington are privately financed and have mostly a very varied financing. Therefore, they are free. And if you are free, you can express much more, and then you can be much more interesting and substantial than if you are state financed. In Europe, by and large, all significant think tanks are state financed. And then you can't really criticize the government that feeds you, because then you will lose the money. And therefore, think tanks in Europe tend to be rather cautious. And if you're cautious, you're not that interesting. So then you easily lose the money that you have got. And then somebody tries another thing, and it fails for the same reason. So for think tanks, non-profit, private financing is vital for independence and survival. I suspect that we will soon see that we say the same about news, that state news are easily manipulated, commercial news, apart from in finance, is becoming quite useless. The good newspapers are going down, and then perhaps this will be a new area for charities to develop. Something that I should have put up here is microfinance. Here, Mohammed Yunus with Grameen Bank in Bangladesh started a totally new world, and now we are seeing that microfinance is becoming something very important, a typical area where neither the state nor the market could fill a hole, and this was an important hole. And after this, what can we see? Bangladesh, that was for a long time considered hopeless by development aid agencies, as far too corrupt to develop, has started developing from below, and this has been happening entirely because of charities, showing something that charities can do and neither the state nor the market can. And I've missed here and advantages of philanthropy that I would like to emphasize. The big fundamental advantage is freedom. Nobody is as free as philanthropic givers. And it's idealistic and it's driven by ideas. Philanthropy can act fast and often be pioneers. And here I'm particularly thinking of George Soros in Eastern Europe. Many others followed him, but it was very much a follow George thing in Eastern Europe. I did several projects with George Soros, and the conversation normally was like this. One told George what one wanted to do, and then George listened, and then he said, "It sounds good, I'll pay for it." And that was it. No unnecessary budgets to begin with, just a clear order, you can go, and then he wanted to see results. Later on, the finance was discussed, but the first was, I pay. You go ahead and do what you have to do. No a big organization, state or private, can act in that fashion. And also, philanthropy can act imaginatively against conventions. It can be non-bureaucratic, and it can be far less costly, as most of all Mohammed Yunus has demonstrated with Grameen Bank. And you might have seen recently that he has proposed how one can reform healthcare so that it wouldn't have to cost so much, so that people in developing countries should be able to get healthcare cheaply. And to this comes the IT revolution. And I think that this is opening enormous possibilities, of course, for all of us, but not least for philanthropy. What it means now is that we have an instant global access to news, but old media collapse. The question is, what will come instead of the old media? And my suspicion is that we will see very interesting philanthropic initiatives on this. And another observation is that government secrecy, as we are now seeing with the NSA scandal in the United States, as well as privacy, are being challenged. It's by no means obvious which side will win, or if you can also put it that both sides are losing. We don't have any privacy, but nor does the government have any possibility to maintain its secrets before. And the big thing which I'm particularly interested in is online education. It can quickly raise education standards throughout the world. So if we look upon much of Europe now, we have higher education on a large scale. Much of it is of poor quality. How can we raise the quality fast? In most bad universities, you have very conservative professors who don't want change. And who are providing lots of promising, ambitious students with a bad education. This is nothing that should continue. And now, all of a sudden, we have a tremendous opportunity to change. The best professors should be, like rock stars, duplicated to tens of thousands of students, so that they can see them on the screen and listen to them. This is already out there in various forms, but it needs to be further organized and taken much further. Of course, you can do tests on the computer, and how can you control it? Somebody here suggested you just have to have a web scan on so that you can see that it's the right person who's sitting behind the computer and provides the results at that very moment. So you don't need really a guard that sits on the spot and does so. And what you need then, in addition to this, it's really a few functions: the social networking, the seminars, the private tutorials with the professors, and that can be organized in different ways. And nobody has an idea really how this will work out. What we can see is that higher education throughout the world is ready for a total change, and we don't know how the change will be undertaken. I think for such truly innovative, large-scale changes, philanthropy is likely to be in the forefront. And I talked here with people from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at the Simon Fraser University in Canada, and we are doing this already in Hellenic Studies for tens of thousands of people with courses. So with this, I would like to end that I see tremendous possibilities for philanthropy in this new social welfare society that we are seeing arising. Thank you.